What happens when the ultimate symbol of an empire's power suddenly becomes the very trap that destroys it? For over 10 years, one man built his entire political survival on a single piece of land, believing it would make him completely untouchable. But the ground beneath his feet is now quietly and rapidly crumbling. Before we uncover how this monumental collapse is about to unfold, take a quick second to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs to see the absolute truth about this war. To truly understand the sheer magnitude of what is happening right now in the Black Sea, we have to go all the way back to the beginning. We have to look closely at the year 2014. That was the year the entire world watched in absolute shock as unmarked soldiers appeared in Crimea. There were no massive battles. There were no shots fired in the streets. It was a completely bloodless takeover that felt like a masterclass in modern hybrid warfare. The world saw a resurgent, aggressive Russia. They saw a leader who had finally restored national pride after decades of perceived humiliation. For Vladimir Putin, this was not just a simple military victory, it was the ultimate personal triumph. It was the exact moment he cemented his place in Russian history as a great restorer of empire. He genuinely believed he had outsmarted the West. He believed he had secured his legacy forever. But empires are rarely built on solid ground when they are built entirely on illusions. Crimea was supposed to be the unbreakable anchor of Russian power in the Black Sea. It was supposed to be an impregnable modern fortress. The Russian military poured billions of dollars into the peninsula over the next decade. They built massive radar installations. They deployed the most advanced air defense systems in their entire arsenal. They turned the historic naval base at Sevastopol into a glowing symbol of unbreakable strength. The message to the world was incredibly clear. Crimea is Russian. It is heavily armed. It is heavily defended. And it is absolutely untouchable. For a few years, that message seemed to work perfectly. The West imposed economic sanctions, but they did not push back militarily. The narrative was set in stone. Russia had won, and the map of Europe had been permanently redrawn. But maps can always be redrawn again, and impenetrable fortresses can very quickly become inescapable prisons. When the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began in early 2022, the strategic reality of Crimea shifted dramatically and permanently. It was no longer just a symbolic prize for the history books. It instantly became the primary logistical hub for the entire southern front of the war. Every single tank, every single bullet, and every single soldier heading to the front lines had to pass through or near the peninsula. It became the beating heart of the Russian war effort. And in the brutal reality of war, the beating heart is always the most attractive and vulnerable target. Ukraine realized very quickly that they did not need to defeat the entire Russian army in a massive, bloody frontal assault. They just needed to make Crimea completely uninhabitable for the Russian military machine. They needed to turn the crown jewel into a toxic, expensive liability. This is where the true genius of the Ukrainian strategy finally reveals itself. They did not try to match Russia, tank for tank or soldier for soldier. They used asymmetric warfare. They used the ocean. They used the sky. They used time. The Black Sea, which the Moscow was supposed to turn into a private Russian lake, quickly became a deadly hunting ground. The first major shock to the system came when the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, the Moskva, was sent to the cold bottom of the sea. It was a massive guided missile cruiser. It was the ultimate symbol of naval dominance, and it was sunk by a relatively cheap Ukrainian-made Neptune missile. The psychological impact on the Russian command was absolutely devastating. It proved that the mighty Russian fleet was not invincible. It proved that their expensive air defense systems were deeply flawed. It proved that the sea belonged to whoever had the courage and the innovation to fight for it. After the humiliating sinking of the Moskva, the Great Retreat began. It was not a physical retreat at first, but a highly tactical one. The major surface ships pulled back in fear. They moved further and further east, away from the vulnerable Crimean coast. They hid in the distant ports of Novorossiysk. They tried to hide behind the mainland coastline. But Ukraine kept pushing the advantage. They used naval drones. These are small, fast, unmanned surface boats packed with high explosives. They swarm the Russian ships in the dark of night. They slip past the clumsy defenses. They strike with terrifying calculated precision. One by one, the Russian landing ships, the patrol boats, and even the submarines were damaged or completely destroyed. The Black Sea Fleet, once the absolute pride of the Russian Navy, was effectively neutralized. It was forced to flee its own historic home port, in Sevastopol. This was a humiliation of historic, almost comedic proportions. If you are finding real value in this deep dive into the key mechanics of modern war, do me a massive favor right now. Pause for just a second, look at the subscribe button below, and click it if you want more unfiltered, high-quality truths like this. Share this video with a friend who still thinks this war is a permanent stalemate, And let us know in the comments what you think is the single biggest mistake Putin made. The loss of naval dominance was only the very beginning of the squeeze. The next phase of the strangulation happened in the air. Ukraine realized that the Russian air bases in Crimea were the primary launch pads for countless deadly missiles and attack drones. These air bases were protected by thick layers of air defense. But Ukraine found a way through the umbrella. They used long-range cruise missiles. They used modified drones detection. They struck the runways. They struck the fuel depots. They struck the expensive aircraft while they were just sitting on the tarmac. The Russian pilots, who were supposed to totally dominate the skies, found themselves constantly looking over their shoulders in fear. They could not safely take off. They could not safely land. The airspace, strict no-fly zone for the enemy, became a deadly, unpredictable gauntlet. Then came the systematic targeting of the land connections. The geography of Crimea is very specific and highly vulnerable. It is a peninsula, which means it is connected to the mainland by a very narrow, easily targeted strip of land. There are only a few critical choke points. The Perekop Isthmus is the main land bridge. There are a few other narrow crossings, but they are all easily targeted by long-range fires. Ukraine has systematically turned these vital choke points into absolute kill zones. Any Russian convoy trying to move crucial supplies into Crimea has to navigate a landscape littered with long-range artillery, drone swarms, and Precision-N missile strikes. The logistics of supplying a massive army through a narrow, heavily targeted corridor is an absolute nightmare. It slows everything down to a crawl. It creates massive, dangerous bottlenecks. It means that the troops on the front lines are constantly running out of ammunition, fuel, and basic food. But the ultimate symbol of this massive logistical vulnerability is the Kerch Bridge, also known as the Crimean Bridge. It is a massive, multi-billion-dollar engineering project. It was personally championed and funded by Putin himself. It was supposed to be the physical, concrete manifestation of Russia's permanent claim to the peninsula. It is over 12 miles long. It carries both road and rail traffic. It was the ultimate, unbreakable lifeline. When the main land routes were disrupted, the Kerch Bridge became the only reliable way to move heavy equipment and massive amounts of supplies. Military knew this, and Ukraine knew this. The attacks on the Kerch Bridge have been a masterclass in both psychological and physical warfare. First, it was a massive truck bomb that blew a huge hole in the road deck. Then, it was naval drones that struck the support pillars from the water below. Then, it was long-range missiles striking the rail bridge. Every single time the bridge is damaged, it sends a very clear, terrifying message. The lifeline can be cut at any moment. The Russian engineers work around the clock to repair it. They use ferries to bypass the broken sections, but the constant threat of destruction creates a massive strain on the supply chain. It forces the Russian military to divert crucial air defense systems just to protect a single bridge. It creates a constant state of anxiety for the commanders who rely on it. The bridge is no longer just a piece of infrastructure. It is a psychological weapon pointed directly at the heart of the Russian war effort. We are now halfway through this deep journey, and the strategic picture is getting much clearer. If this detailed analysis is shifting your perspective on the conflict, drop a comment below with your favorite historical parallel to this situation, share this video to help break the algorithm, and subscribe so you never miss a crucial breakdown. Your continued support keeps this channel completely independent, sharp, and focused on the truth. Now, we need to look far beyond the military tactics. We need to look at the brutal political reality. Because losing Crimea is not just a standard military defeat. It is a direct political death sentence for Vladimir Putin. To truly understand why this is the case, you have to understand exactly how Putin built and maintained his power over the last 2 decades. He did not build it on strong democratic institutions. He did not build it on a diversified, robust economy. He built it entirely on the projection of absolute strength. He built it on the core idea that he is the only man who can protect Russia from a hostile, encircling West. He built it on the grand promise of restoring the lost glory of the Russian Empire. Every single decision he makes is filtered through this specific, rigid lens. He cannot afford to look weak. He cannot afford to lose. When he annexed Crimea in 2014, he tied his personal political survival directly to the peninsula. He held a highly publicized theatrical signing ceremony in the grand, golden halls of the Kremlin. He gave a passionate, emotional speech to the parliament. He told the Russian people that Crimea had always been Russian and that it would remain Russian forever. He made it a matter of deep national honor. He made it a matter of his personal honor. In the minds of the Russian public, and much more importantly, in the minds of the Russian elite, Putin and Crimea are now permanently, inextricably linked. If Crimea falls, the core myth of Putin's invincibility falls with it. The Russian elite, the wealthy oligarchs, the military generals, the security chiefs, they all support Putin primarily because they believe he's a consistent winner. They believe he's the ultimate strongman who will protect their vast wealth and their political power. But strong men only survive as long as they keep winning. The moment the tide turns, the moment the victories stop coming, the elite start to look for the exits. They start to calculate their own personal survival. We have already seen terrifying glimpses of this elite fracture. We saw it clearly in the mutiny led by Yevgeny Prigozhin and the Wagner Group. Prigozhin was a loyal insider. He was a core part of the system. But when he felt the regular military leadership was failing catastrophically, he marched his armed men on Moscow. It was a massive, unprecedented shock to the Kremlin. It showed the world that the loyalty of the armed factions is not absolute. It is strictly conditional on success. If the Ukrainian military manages to breach the deep defenses and push into Crimea, the political shockwaves will be absolutely catastrophic. The Russian soldiers on the ground will suddenly realize they are trapped on a peninsula with their backs to the unforgiving sea. The supply lines will be completely cut. The air support will be gone. The naval support will be gone. The psychological collapse of the Russian army in Crimea would be instantaneous and total. It would not be a slow, organized retreat. It would be a chaotic, desperate rout. And the horrific images of a defeated Russian army fleeing Crimea would be broadcast to every single living room in Russia. The massive propaganda machine in Moscow would not be able to hide the truth. They could not spin a massive naval evacuation or a chaotic retreat as a strategic success. The public would see the undeniable truth. The myth would shatter into a million pieces. And when the myth shatters, the rigid political structure built on top of it begins to crack and crumble. This is not just wild speculation. This is the established historical pattern of autocratic regimes. When you look closely at the history of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, you see a very clear repeating pattern. They do not slowly, gracefully decline. They look incredibly strong and invincible right up until the exact moment they suddenly, violently collapse. Think about the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. The Russian Empire looked like a massive, unstoppable land. Power. But after a series of humiliating naval and land defeats, the public unrest boiled over into the First Russian Revolution. The Tsar was forced to make major concessions. The foundation of his absolute power was permanently cracked. Think about World War I. The Russian Empire had the largest army in the world. It looked completely formidable on paper. But the massive logistical failures, the horrific casualties, and the total economic collapse led to a sudden total implosion. The Tsar was forced to abdicate. The empire was gone forever. Think about the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan. The Soviet Union was a global superpower, but after a decade of grinding, unwinnable war, the economic and political strain became too much. The system collapsed from within. The Soviet Union dissolved into history. In all these cases, the external military failures were the direct catalyst for internal political collapse. The wars did not just drain inside the system. The war in Ukraine is doing the exact same thing to the current regime. It is exposing the deep corruption in the military. It is exposing the sheer incompetence of the generals. It is exposing the fatal fragility of the economy. And the potential loss of Crimea will be the final, undeniable, catastrophic proof that the entire E-system is failing. Putin has spent over 2 decades centralizing all power in his own hands. He has eliminated all political opposition. He has silenced all critics. But by doing so, he has also eliminated all alternative leaders. He has created a rigid system where there is no clear, peaceful successor. If his power weakens, there is no orderly transition. There's only a chaotic, dangerous power vacuum. The oligarchs who have made billions under Putin will suddenly realize that their wealth is not safe. The regional leaders who rely on Moscow's funding will start to look out for themselves. The military commanders who have lost thousands of their men will demand answers. The mothers of the conscripts who are being sent to die on the beaches of Crimea will demand justice. The social contract in Russia is breaking rapidly. The government is asking for more and more sacrifices from the public, but it is no longer delivering the victories it promised. And this is where the deeper analysis reveals a terrifying reality for the Kremlin. The loss of Crimea would not just end the war, it would likely end the current political system in Russia entirely. Putin knows this dark reality. That is why he has escalated the rhetoric so dramatically. That is why he has threatened nuclear weapons. That is why he has mobilized hundreds of thousands of men. He's not just fighting Ukraine. He is fighting for his own political survival. He is fighting to prevent the exact scenario we are discussing today. He is trying to create a frozen conflict. He is trying to build enough defenses to make the cost of retaking Crimea too high for Ukraine and the West to bear. But the problem with building a massive fortress is that it requires constant maintenance. It requires endless resources. And Russia is running out of both. The economy is overheating. The military is stretched to its absolute limits. They are relying on aging Soviet equipment. They are relying on supplies from North Korea and Iran. They are relying on prisoners and conscripts who have no desire to fight. The Russian military is a hollow force. It looks massive on the outside, but it is incredibly brittle on the inside. When the pressure is applied, it does not bend. It breaks. The Ukrainian strategy is perfectly designed to apply this exact pressure. They are not trying to break the Russian army in a single massive battle. They are slowly dismantling the logistical and operational foundation of the Russian occupation. They are sinking the ships. They are destroying the airbases. They are targeting the bridges. They are striking the oil refineries deep inside Russia. They are stretching the Russian defenses so thin that they cannot cover every vulnerability. They are waiting for the moment when the Russian system simply cannot absorb any more shocks. When that moment comes, when the first Ukrainian flags are raised in the towns of northern Crimea, the cascade will be completely unstoppable. The Russian command will panic. They will order retreats that turn into routes. They will try to evacuate troops across the Kerch Bridge, but the bridge will be targeted. They will try to evacuate by sea, but the ports will be under fire. The Black Sea, which was supposed to be their safe haven, will become a graveyard for their retreating forces. The psychological impact on the Russian public will be absolute. The narrative of the strong, invincible leader will be replaced by the reality of a failing, desperate regime. This is the central tension of the entire war. It is not just about territory. It is not just about borders. It is about the fundamental nature of power. Putin built his power on the idea that might makes right. He believed that because Russia was bigger, because it had more nuclear weapons, because it had a larger army, it could simply take what it wanted. He believed that the West was weak, that the West was divided, and that the West would eventually accept the new reality. But he underestimated the resilience of the Ukrainian people. He underestimated the unity of the West. And most importantly, he overestimated the strength of his own system. He thought he was playing a grand game of geopolitical chess, but he was actually playing a dangerous game of structural engineering. He removed the load-bearing walls of the post-Cold War order, thinking he could control the collapse. But when you remove the load-bearing walls, the entire structure comes down. And the loss of Crimea will be the moment the roof finally caves in. It will be the moment the illusion shatters completely. It will be the moment the world realizes that the Russian Empire is not resurgent. It is decaying. The cost of this decay will be immense. It will cost Putin his power. It will shatters. The rigid political structure built on top of it begins to crack and crumble. This is not power on the idea that might makes right. He believed that because Russia was bigger, because it had more nuclear weapons, because it had a larger army, it could simply take what it wanted. He believed that the West was weak, that the West was divided, and that the West would have empire had the largest army in the world. It looked completely formidable on paper. But the massive logistical failures, the horrific casualties, and the total economic collapse led to a sudden total implosion. The Tsar was forced to abdicate. The empire was gone forever. Think about the Soviets. You see a very clear repeating pattern. They do not slowly, gracefully decline. They look incredibly strong and invincible right up until the exact moment they suddenly, violently collapse. Think about the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. The Russian Empire established a historical pattern of autocratic regimes. When you look closely at the history of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, you see it shatters. The rigid political structure built on top of it begins to crack and crumble. This is not just wild speculation. This is the established historical pattern of autocratic regimes. When you look closely at the history of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, you see a very clear repeating pattern. Shatters. The rigid political structure built on top of it begins to crack and crumble. This is not just wild speculation. This is the moment the illusion of the new Russian Empire finally died. The story of Crimea is the ultimate story of hubris. It is the story of a leader who completely believed his own propaganda. It is the story of an empire that overreached and broke its own back in the process. History is filled with the cold graves of empires that thought they were eternal. They all fell. They all collapsed. And they all fell because they forgot that true power does not come from the size of your army or the length of your borders. True power comes from the resilience of your people, the strength of your institutions, and the justice of your cause. Russia has none of those things in this war. And that is why the ground beneath Putin's feet is crumbling. That is why the crown jewel is turning into a deadly trap. And that is why the loss of Crimea will cost him absolutely everything. Thank you so much for watching this deep dive into the harsh reality of the war. If this video helped you understand the true high stakes of the conflict, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel for more in-depth analysis, and share this video with anyone who needs to see the bigger picture. The truth is out there, and together we can make sure it is heard loud and clear. Stay informed, stay vigilant, and we will see you in the next video.